Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast, episode 21, season 2. Super great and nerdy episode for you all this week with Mr. David Blanchard of Pleasant Hill Farm. David and his wife Cindy Rubenfine run a 1.1 acre market garden in Nova Scotia, Canada, and there is a lot of cool stuff going on there. First, I should say, David will tell you from the outset, they are not a purely no-tillage farm. And although they do some really interesting low-till stuff and have been doing a bunch of different kind of intriguing no-till trials that we talk about, their main system is sort of a strip tillage with spader and cover crops. And people jump on me sometimes when tillage comes up on the podcast. But just a reminder, we're not dogmatic about any of this stuff here. This podcast is and has always been about ecological growing systems. Take what you like, what fits your values and your systems, leave what you don't. But for my part, I'm very interested in this idea of living pathways and incorporating them into our own system here at Rough Draft Farmstead. But I'm rambling because the most important part of this conversation has nothing to do with strip tillage. David has been a long time critic of the deep compost mulch system and its potential to pollute with nitrogen and phosphorus. So I give him the floor and let him make his argument. That's a huge part of this conversation, and I think it's an important one. I think we should always be challenging ourselves. It is because I believe so much in no-till that I do challenge it. So I had a lot of fun here. I learned a ton, and I could not have done it without the help of our show sponsors like Growing for Market Magazine. Welcome back.
Hi, I'm Andrew Mefford, editor of Growing for Market Magazine. We're excited to be back sponsoring the No-Till Market Garden podcast, so we made a code for listeners to get 25% off any subscription. Head on over to growingformarket.com and enter the code WORM, that's WORM, for the discount. We're still on the same mission as when the flower farmer author Lynn Basinski founded the magazine 29 years ago, to be a resource written by farmers for farmers with practical ideas and information to help local farms succeed. There are a decade of back issues and articles available online, plus subscribers automatically get 20% off any of the books we sell, including the No-Till book bundle of 3 no-till books listed together at 10% off the cover price, so you can add your subscriber discount and get a total of 30% off the price of all 3. If you do farmers markets, a farm stand, CSA, local wholesaling, dream of starting a no-till farm, or a little of everything, if you like what you're hearing on the podcast, go to Growing for Market and use the code WORM for 25% off any subscription.
Also, big shout out to show sponsor Farmers Web.
Farmers Web software makes it easier for your farm to manage working with your buyers. By lessening the administrative load and increasing efficiency, Farmers Web helps you save time, reduce errors, and work with more buyers overall. Our free account includes features to manage your real-time and coming soon product availability, and tools to create your own availability calendar to inform buyers on the seasonality of your products. The free account also includes access to the Farmers Web Guide to Working with Wholesale Buyers, which offers pro tips and best practices on how to work with restaurants, schools, and other similar buyers. A 1-month free trial is available of the paid account, which includes features to manage your customers and orders, give select buyers special pricing and payment terms, track your buyers' payments, send invoices, keep detailed sales records, and much more. You can even manage orders for buyers who don't place them online. Access a demo video and learn more at farmersweb.com.
Okay, big thanks to our show sponsors. One quick note, there's a little popping in David's audio from time to time. It comes and goes and never stays around for long, but it is there, and it is kind of right there at the beginning, so I apologize for that. But muscle through it, because this is an important and honestly fun conversation with Mr. David Blanchard of Pleasant Hill Farm. David Blanchard, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jesse. It's great to talk with you.
It's great to talk with you as well. I'm sure that everyone over at the no-tillgrowers.com forum is kind of cheering right now. In fact, I don't think I've had more requests for a single guest than you, because you have quite the fan base over there. So nerdy farm celebrity aside, you still have to start where everyone else does. So I'm hoping that, David, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your farm, where you're located, and those sorts of things.
Sure. So we're located in Pleasant River, Nova Scotia. and we've been on this farm since 2007. I should maybe say that my wife and I are both originally from the U.S. We both have citizenship in both the U.S. and Canada, and we have lived and farmed in both countries. Before moving to Nova Scotia in 2007, we were doing vegetable farming in Maine. And prior to that, we were doing dairy farming in northwest Pennsylvania, up near Erie. We both spent most of the 1970s working on other people's farms. Neither of us grew up on a farm, although in my case, it just skipped one generation. Both of my grandfathers were involved in the dairy business. One had a dairy farm in way up in the very northern end of Vermont, and my other grandfather was a milk truck driver, so he hauled milk from the farms through the creamery. I grew up in farm country and started doing farm work when I was, I guess, 15 years old. Just because it was, if you wanted a job like to save money for college or to buy a car or whatever, that's the work that was there. So I started doing it, not really planning on it as a career. I've been interested in science ever since I was a kid, and my game plan in high school was to go to college and do some sort of science major. But I worked on farms all through high school, and I worked for a vegetable farmer who was a frustrated dairy farmer. What he really wanted to be was a dairy farmer. He had a degree in dairy science, but because of the huge capital investment to get into dairy, he had gone into vegetables instead. And then after I got out of high school, I went to college for a year, was working on a major in physics, got pretty disillusioned with that, and just went back to doing full-time farm work for other people. Met my wife in 1979, got married later that year, and in 1980, we went into business for ourselves as dairy farmers. So that 1980 was the year we first bought a farm of our own. Had an enormous debt load because dairy takes a lot of capital investment. You know, there's cows, there's machinery, there's barns, there's land. It's a really different scene to get started in than vegetable farming is. And we stuck it out at that till the mid-1990s. In the U.S., the dairy market is very much up and down in terms of milk price. Like the last couple of years, it's been through a major downturn, and there's been a big exodus from dairying in the U.S. Well, the same thing happened in the mid-1990s, where we were getting like 1970s milk prices, but we're paying 1990s input costs. And it just wasn't working out for us. So we sold the cows, kept the farm, sold baled hay, contract raised dairy heifers for another farmer. And the family vegetable garden, which had always been there, just kept getting bigger and bigger. And we had more than we needed. So we started selling some to the local natural foods co-op, and eventually pretty much got out of livestock and fully into vegetables, and have been doing that ever since. So on the current farm, it's mostly a vegetable farm. It's now just my wife and I. We have in the past run a bigger operation and had employees, but we're in our mid-60s and decided to scale back a little bit. So now it's just the two of us. We are farming, actually growing vegetables on about 1.1 acres, and that includes 6 greenhouses. 5 of them are 20 by 60s, and 1 is a 30 by 96. And for our outdoor production, we have 150 permanent beds, which are 4 feet wide and 80 feet long, with 2-foot permanent sod pathways in between them. We're farming highly erodible, sloping, sandy loam soil. So fighting soil erosion is really important to us. So all of these beds are laid out across the slopes to help fight erosion. And our goal is to absolutely minimize the amount of bare exposed soil that we have at any time. And then going through the winter, the goal is to have 0 bare soil. either through cover crops or in the case of crops that finished up too late to establish a cover crop, then we'll use a mulch of hay or straw to keep the soil covered. We also have a sort of a modest-sized flock of laying hens. It averages about 100 right now. Today, I think there are 70 hens. A long-time interest of ours, because of our long association with livestock farming, is highly managed intensive grazing. So during the pasture season, which for us is about 6.5 months long, the chickens are being intensively grazed. They're moved 6 days a week. We don't move them on farmers market day because we have to leave home so early to get to the market. We've also had a small beef cattle herd. We're actually in the process of selling the beef cattle off just because, I mentioned earlier, we're trying to slow down a little bit and looking at where the money comes from and where the money goes. The beef cattle were more of a sink than a source of money and a fair amount of work. So at least for the time being, we're getting out of the cattle business. But they were also on an intensive grazing program. We were doing 100% grass-finished beef.
And then with those pathways, are you just mowing those? You said they were 2-foot permanent sod, right?
Yes. Yeah, we manage them by mowing. And so most of the field work that we do outside is done with a tractor. We have a sort of a medium-sized 45 horsepower tractor, and it straddles the beds. And so its wheels are always running on those permanent sod paths, so that we're not getting any wheel traffic in the beds themselves. And we're not a pure no-till farm. We do some tillage when we need to establish a seed bed. We use a 3-point hitch spading machine, which is 4 feet wide. That's where the 4-foot width of the beds comes from. And so if we do tillage, the tractor straddles the bed. We use the spading machine. We have a compost spreader that we use for applying compost. We have a flail mower. All these implements go on the 3-point hitch, so it's always the tractor straddling the beds. And then for mowing the paths, we either use a lawnmower or we also have one of those Berta 2-foot wide flail mowers that goes on a BCS walking tractor. So we can use that if the grass on the paths gets too out of hand to handle with the lawnmower.
Sure. And did you establish what was in those pathways, or is that just kind of native grasses that are there?
It's just native grass. So when we bought the farm, it was it hadn't been actively farmed for decades, other than having the hay mowed and sold off. So in terms of nutrients, the farm had kind of been mined out for a long time by having hay sold off of it and not a whole lot put back in. But it's the basic sandy loam soil. It's a really nice vegetable soil. It's just that for the first number of years, we had to build the nutrient levels up quite a bit, which we did partly with the manure from our own livestock, but also in the initial years, we would buy poultry manure and compost that on farm and use that to build up the nutrient levels in our beds.
Well, one thing I want to comment on is you mentioned the sandy soil and having to build that up. I know when I spoke with Broad Fork Farm, they talked about having the white clover pathways and that worked pretty well. They think because the sand didn't allow it to creep as much. Do you kind of find that that's part of why you were able to keep those permanent sod pathways and keeping them specifically, like keeping them out of the beds?
We have not had a lot of problems controlling the grass in the pathways. And I think part of that is because, a given bed probably gets a tillage event once every, 2 or 3 years. And that if the grass has started to creep into the beds, that does, set it back. But we're also doing a lot of mulching mostly with hay. And we'll talk about that in a minute, because I know a lot of people think hay as a mulch is a terrible thing. Also some with grown in place straw, so straw that originated from grain cover crops. And we find that a good thick mulch is also quite effective in controlling the the encroachment of the sod pathways into the beds. I think it would be really nice to have pure or almost pure white clover pathways. Our issue with doing that is we would have had to till out the pathways and then try to reseed them. And with the torrential rains that we're getting more and more of here, it might be a challenge to get the paths reestablished with something growing in them before they washed out from rain. So partly for that reason, and partly also just because there's only so much you can do in life, we're just living with the native grasses and clovers that are there in the paths, and it's basically working out pretty well. Another thing that's nice about it is that we always have a relatively solid and firm place to walk on when we're harvesting or doing whatever out among those beds. It's nice to have sod to walk on instead of muddy pathways.
Okay, so I want to hear a little bit, like you mentioned the hay mulch. I kind of want to just go ahead and dive into that because I think that's interesting because absolutely it's something that we've struggled with in terms of just putting a bunch of weed seed in. So can you talk about using hay mulch?
Yeah, so because we have livestock, we are set up to make hay on the farm. We don't have a huge amount of hay land. We've got about 10 acres that is either pastured or hayed. And so by making hay ourselves, we are able to control what's in it. Because like here in Nova Scotia, there is no mature seed in hay until probably early July, because the hay doesn't really start growing until typically the first or second week in May. And it takes until sometime in July for it to have actually produced viable seed. So any hay that you make before then is going to be pretty much free of weed seeds. The other thing is that thinking about it from a livestock nutrition point of view, the hay is at its peak of nutritional value for livestock in, say, late May or early June, and it continues to be really good hay nutritionally up until pretty much the end of June. And then as you start to get into July and the hay becomes over mature, the nutritional value from a livestock point of view starts to decline. So if it's good food for a cow, it's also food for soil microbes, because inside a cow, it's rumen microbes that are digesting the hay. So in a way, the rumen of a cow is kind of like a soil ecosystem. So if you are putting like good feed quality hay down as a mulch, not only are you not putting weed seeds down, you're also adding a significant amount of plant nutrients. So the mulch can serve as a source of nutrients as well as a weed suppression thing.
That's interesting. So for what we found is it's hard to get somebody to bring us hay that kind of has that, I don't know, maybe has the sort of intentional view of hay in that same way. And so, yeah, oftentimes.
Yeah, so there's kind of.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say there's sort of two markets for hay. There's so-called mulch hay, which unless it's a situation where weed seeds are not a problem, like say you were mulching a newly seeded highway cut or something like that, except in a situation like that, so-called mulch hay, which is over-mature, full of weed seeds, and has very little nutrients in it, is kind of useless to a vegetable farmer. If you wanted to buy hay that would work well as a vegetable mulch, you would be looking for what's sometimes called dairy quality hay. So hay that was cut early enough that it has some feed value to it. And of course, hay like that is going to be considerably more expensive than mulch hay, which usually is, was cut late. It was often rained on when it was being made, and so it's basically junk hay. But a lot of times, if you look at the value of the nutrients that you're buying in with a bale of good hay, it's a good deal. Just something to think about. So, and the availability of that kind of hay is going to vary a lot depending on where your vegetable farm is. But if you're in an area that has a lot of livestock farming going on, especially dairy farming, that kind of hay may be available. It may not, because there may be a lot of competition from the dairy farmers for it. But at least in an area where, with that kind of livestock farming going on, that sort of hay is going to be being made, and maybe it's available at a price you can afford.
Yeah, and that's interesting because the few farmers who I associate that sort of like haylage, like people that actually grow wheat and stuff strictly for the hay, um, and that's sort of growing the most highly nutritious hay and cutting it at the right time. Those are almost always dairy farmers.
Yeah, right, exactly. But yeah, it's just, again, it's something to think about. It can be a really effective weed suppressor, and it's nice stuff to work with because good quality hay is soft. It's not all stemmy and coarse, so it shakes out pretty nicely.
And then what are you doing? Are you using the chickens to sort of refertilize where that hay is, where you're cutting that hay from?
Exactly. Yeah. So the one thing we didn't talk about earlier was the actual size of the farm. It's 114 acres total, but 100 of that is woodlot. And so another big interest of ours that we don't have time to go into today is we're really interested in sustainable forestry, carbon storage in forests, that whole thing. That woodlot provides us as an energy source to heat our home. And in the spring, we also heat some of our greenhouses to get a jump on heat-loving crops like tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, and so forth. So of the 14 acres that's left, that's where we make our hay and grow our vegetables. And we are certified organic, so there are constraints in terms of fresh manure on vegetable beds. So the vegetable beds are separate from the pasture and hay land, which that surrounds the vegetable beds, which are sort of with the paths and the tractor lanes and everything. It's about 1.5 acres of vegetable beds in the center of this hay and pasture thing. And then there's we have a big problem with white-tailed deer as a pest in crops, and so we have a double deer fence around the inner perimeter of the pasture. So the interface between the pasture and the vegetable fields is one of those two-height double deer fences, electric fence, which we put in about 6 years ago, and that's been really effective in keeping the deer out of the vegetables.
Are you using with the hay? Are you cutting that with a classic hay setup with a baler and everything, or is it something more manual?
Yeah, no, it's a classic hay setup. Partly because that's the way we always have made hay, and where we live, the people who are doing hay commercially, so like the livestock farmers or people who are making hay to sell it, have almost entirely gone to round bales because you basically can't hire anybody anymore to handle square bales. And the round baling is just so much faster and less labor intensive. So there's a lot of square bale machinery just sitting unused, and it can be bought in our area very economically. So yeah, we have a hay bine and a hay rake and a baler, and that's what we make the hay with.
That's really fascinating because you think like what a lot of people say is don't make hay because you can't, because it's so expensive to get the equipment and it'll never pay for itself. But thinking about the fact that, yeah, I see very few people doing square bales anymore.
Right.
And that's the only bale I would even consider using because, hey, I don't have any means to move a round bale. Those things are so incredibly heavy.
Exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, now that the price is maybe diving on those, that could be something that would be something maybe people could look at.
Definitely. And then our other source of mulch, as I briefly mentioned before, is cover crops, either oats or mostly rye that we plant in the fall. And the oats don't survive the winter, but the rye does. And then in the spring, the rye puts on this big burst of growth. And by the time it's starting to head out, if it did well, it's 6 feet tall and a pretty dense stand. So right now we're handling that by flail mowing it. We're really interested in trying a roller crimper. And in fact, we're right now in the process of sourcing a 4.5-foot wide roller crimper that would go on our 3-point hitch that would be sized for our beds.
Nice. And are you going for the one like the chevron style?
The chevron style really seems to be the way to go. It's a little just a little more costly to buy because it's a little more tricky to make. But the ones that have bars, where the crimping bars just go straight across the roller, as it's going through the field, it's going bump, 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 which apparently is unpleasant for the tractor operator and also puts a lot of stress on the machinery because it's just a constant jarring motion. Whereas with the chevron, one part or another of the blade is always engaged with the soil. So it's a continuous action rather than a bump, bump, bump action.
Yeah, that's a great way. I've never heard it described like that, but that's a perfect image right there. So let's get into, well, one thing that we didn't kind of cover is how you actually sell the produce. You said it's just the two of you, and
just the two of us, yeah.
1.1 acres is quite a lot. Like, how does that? So how are you all selling that?
So over the years, we've tried just about every marketing outlet there is. We've done a lot of wholesaling in the past. For a while, we had a CSA. We've always done farmers markets. We've done direct sales to natural food stores and restaurants and like locally owned smaller grocery stores. But right now, it's entirely through one farmers market, which we go to 51 weeks a year. We take the week between Christmas and New Year's off, if there even is a market that week. And then we have one restaurant that buys from us every week. And our gross sales per year run between $110,000 and $115,000. We're 2 markets away from being done for this year, so I can tell you pretty definitely, barring a weather catastrophe or something that causes a market to be canceled, we're going to be at about 112.5 for 2019. So of the 1.1 acres, at any given time, about half of that is in cover crops. So it's resting. So we're actually growing on about 70 to 75 of those 150 beds that are outdoors. And then the greenhouses are in continuous production year round. And we have a cold storage that we made out of an old reefer trailer. And in the fall, we put a lot of cabbage, carrots, onions, some beets, although this year we didn't have a very good beet crop. And so we'll sell those throughout the winter. And then we produce greens throughout the winter. In our greenhouses, we also have a fairly significant microgreens operation, which goes year round. It's based in our transplant greenhouse in the summer. And right now it's in the basement of our house, which has a wood burning furnace in it. So it's warm. And we have over the years built some benches in there and added lights. We started off with fluorescent lights, and starting last winter, we started replacing those with LED grow lights. And oh my gosh, what a difference. We did some, the LED lights used about half the power that the equivalent number of fluorescent lights would use. And we did some yield comparisons last year because we had both LEDs and fluorescents going. And we recorded yield increases of up to 40% on microgreens under the LED grow lights as opposed to the fluorescents. And whereas the fluorescents had to be like a solid bank of fluorescent tubes really close to the top of the crop canopy, so it's difficult to get in there and water and work and so forth. The LEDs, it's like one LED lamp that's maybe 18 inches long and 9 inches wide and 3 inches thick, hangs 3 feet above the crop, and that replaces a 4 by 4 foot solid bank of fluorescent tubes. So just in terms of the ease of working under them and so forth, it's so much nicer with the LEDs. So that's been kind of a cool experiment to try. It's a bit of an investment, although the price of them has really come down the last few years. And like if you were starting out a microgreens or say a transplant operation from scratch and you were going to buy lights, it's now just as economical to buy LED grow lights as it would be to buy the equivalent number of fluorescents. Now that's if you're buying like the more modestly priced LEDs. There are these super high-tech LEDs where you can vary the spectrum, to optimize the light needs of the crop as it grows, and they control computer control the amount of light, the total amount of light they're putting on the crop in the course of a day. Those are really expensive still. But for growing microgreens or transplants, you don't need those.
Yeah, 40%. I mean, I feel like you could make up that cost pretty quickly if you're getting a 40% increase in your yield.
Right, and you're spending half as much on electricity.
Right. So 40%. Yeah, that's a huge gain.
So anyway, getting back, we got digressed from marketing. So yeah, we are fortunate to be members of a really, really great farmers market, and like I said, we're there 51 weeks a year, and our restaurant buys about $10,000 to $12,000 worth of produce from us per year. So the remaining 100,000 or so is all going through this one farmers market, one day a week, with a stall that costs us $25 a week.
That's
so
great.
It's fantastic, yeah. And so our sales vary quite a lot between winter and summer, partly because in the part of Nova Scotia we are, which is called the South Shore, so it's sort of the Atlantic coast of Nova Scotia, it's big tourist country. And so in the summertime, there are probably twice as many people around as there are in the winter. And our sales reflect that. So in the wintertime, like right now, we're doing $1,800 to $2,000 a week in sales. At our peak in August, which is when the tourist season peaks, we'll do like $4,500 to $4,800 a week. And that's intense for two people. Honestly, we want to back down from that a little bit, just because by the end of August, we're pretty wiped out, because it's a lot for two people to harvest and wash and pack and market and grow. But, being able to do that for a market that, like, we spend roughly $1,200 a year at stall fees at that market. So about 1% of our gross for the year goes directly to our marketing cost. And to me, that's pretty amazing. The market is a vendor-owned co-op. So we, the vendors, own it and elect a board of directors who hire a manager, and we've got a good board and a fantastic manager, and it's all reflected in how well the market runs.
Oh, it makes all the difference. I mean, that $1,200, one, that's like a month's rent on basically any brick and mortar, or a low month's rent. But also, yeah, what you're paying for. Like, I'm happy to give money every week to our market and market manager, because they do such a good job. And that's so undervalued, I think, just being able to invest in that, especially if you're a co-op. I think that's great. How many hours do you think that you and Cindy are putting?
I would say in the summer, we put in 80 hours plus. In August, we're probably putting in 90 hours, which again, where we're at in life, it's not really what we want to be doing anymore. So we're interested in easing it back a little bit. And then in the winter, we probably work 50 to 60 hours a week. And some of that is sit down work in the house. It's planning, it's doing the income taxes, it's analyzing last year's numbers, that sort of thing. So that's kind of a welcome break from the grind of production. But yeah, we work a lot of hours, and we're interested in slowing down a bit. But it's, basically we like what we're doing. It's good work. It's very satisfying work. I honestly think that working on, developing and carrying out a truly sustainable and regenerative agriculture, it's as important a work as there is anywhere in the world. More important than a lot of work. There is some work that's as important, but I'm really not convinced that there's any work that is more important. Just looking at where humanity is going in terms of population numbers, in terms of our environmental impact, in terms of climate change, and trying to do something about that. It's work you can feel. Farming is work that you can feel good about doing, because it's valuable, it's important. You're producing a product that people literally cannot live without. And if you're managing to do that without pesticide residues and, various unfavorable environmental impacts that a lot of agriculture has, that's just all to the good. So that makes up for the fact that you're not particular. Like if you think about what you're making on a per hour basis, it's not great. Or if you think about the return that you're getting on your investment, for most of us, it's not great. But if you are enjoying what you're doing, that's what really counts.
Well, yeah, I agree with that, and I want to make sure that I'm clear on something. When you say you're working 80 or 90 hours in the summer, you're talking about each of you were working 80 or 90 hours, or that's total?
Yes, that's each. That is each.
Hey all, we have obviously mentioned the forum several times in this conversation, and last month we put the forum on the chopping block a little bit. We even kind of put everybody on alert that we're just going to move it over to Facebook. It's like $20 a month to manage, and we were trying to cut costs to stay afloat. But we've decided to just cut some other things because the forum really meets our mission. It gives people who don't love Facebook, myself very much included in that, a place to converse, and the conversations are honestly generally really nerdy and really soil and science based. It's just an amazing place to learn, and David in particular has been a force over there. So check that out at no-tillgrowers.com under the community tab, and if you appreciate it, consider kicking in a few bucks at Venmo to @no-tillgrowers, or signing up to be a patron at patreon.com/farmerjesse, where at certain levels you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs this week to James Fortier, Weaver Akers, Liam Miller, Katrina Procaccini, Steve Larson, Tyler Lineman, Christine Harris, and Wild Mountain Seeds. Thank you all so much for your support. Back to David. Yeah, so one thing that I really want to get into with you is you've spent a lot of time on this, and you've definitely studied it really well. I want to talk about nutrient management on organic farms. And you can kind of start anywhere you want with that, because I'm curious, one, kind of how you all do nutrient management. You mentioned the cover crops and some amount of compost. Can you just kind of dive into that for us a little bit and tell us what you've learned and how you kind of came to that conclusion?
Yeah, I guess my focus on nutrient management comes partly from having been involved in livestock farming in the past, where, like, when you go to farm meetings and so forth, because in livestock farming you're producing a significant amount of manure, which has a significant potential to be an environmental problem if it's handled wrong. You're bombarded with information about how to deal with your manure wisely. So I've just sort of been indoctrinated for a long time about the importance of thinking about the nutrients that are coming onto your farm, the nutrients that are being exported when you sell product, and what is the balance between those two. And then also, how do you handle the nutrients in terms of practical farm management in a way that optimizes their use for their crops and minimizes any losses to the environment, which can cause problems. I also have some formal education in soil science. I went to ag school for a while. I never finished the degree because this was back in the 1970s, and I've been interested in organic agriculture since I was a teenager. So I went to ag school being interested in organic agriculture at a time where you literally, and nowhere in North America could you take a course in organic agriculture at an ag school. The coursework simply didn't exist, and the attitude towards organic was mostly one of outright hostility. So it was not a real happy place to be. I learned a lot of good stuff, but back then, soil science was essentially soil chemistry. So I learned a ton about chemistry, which is interesting and useful. But if you were to take soil science today, there would be a lot about biology and ecology. Back in the 70s, that simply was not part of the curriculum. So anyway, I never finished the soil science degree, but I did get a good grounding in it. And in that coursework also, there was an emphasis, even back then, about the need for nutrient management back then the slant was more about economics than it was about environmental considerations. It was like, if you're buying fertilizer and it's ending up in a lake or a river, you have wasted money, which is true. It's a perfectly valid point. But today there would be a lot more emphasis on the damage that you are doing to that lake or river, as well as losing money. And back in the 70s, it was, that wasn't really so much of a consideration. So anyway, that's a little bit about the nutrient management background. And really, nutrient management is just an accounting system. Nutrients in, nutrients out, what is the balance? And meanwhile, what is happening to nutrients on the farm itself, in the farm ecosystem? Because the nutrients out part of the equation has two components. One is you're selling product off the farm, and that carries nutrients with it. So that's the intended nutrient loss. But then the unintended nutrient loss is the nitrogen that leaches or the phosphorus that runs off the surface. So the unintended losses where the nutrients end up in the environment instead of in somebody's food. And it turns out that the plant nutrients that escape into the environment, mostly being carried by or in water, can become a serious environmental problem. And mostly here we're talking about nitrogen and phosphorus. And nitrogen is extremely mobile in the environment. It's chemically reactive, it's biologically active. If you bring in more nitrogen than your plants can use, for the most part, it's not going to stick around. It's either going to end up back in the atmosphere through a process called denitrification, which is it's the opposite of nitrogen fixation, like what clover does. So clover takes atmospheric nitrogen, converts it into a fixed form that plants can use. In denitrification, the fixed nitrogen goes back to gaseous nitrogen in the atmosphere. So that's one mode of loss. Or if it gets into water, mostly as nitrate, then it can be, for instance, toxic to people, like if it gets into a well. Nitrates in drinking water can be a serious health problem. Or nitrates in waters like lakes is one of the two things that causes eutrophication, so the big algae blooms, like we've been seeing in Lake Erie for the past number of years in the summer, where the whole western end of the lake turns green. And then phosphorus is not mobile in the soil, not very mobile in the soil, but it's a little bit mobile because when phosphorus gets taken up by plant roots, they take it up out of the soil water. So in order for plants to use phosphorus, it's got to be dissolved in water. So it's phosphate ions in water solution. And the concentration of phosphorus in the soil water at any one time is really, really low. But still, if a lot of water leaches through the soil, or especially if water runs off the soil surface, so say in parts of the world where the ground freezes and you get snow, a real common scenario would be for snow melting because it's a sunny or a rainy day, and the snow is sitting on top of ground that's still frozen, and the ground is frozen because the snow has been insulating it. The only thing that snow melt water can do is run off. So for instance, if you have spread manure in the fall or the winter, or spread compost on your growing beds in the fall and left it over the winter so that it would be ready to go in the spring, if you get one of these snowmelt events where there's a lot of water moving over the soil surface, it is going to carry some of that dissolved phosphorus with it. And although the concentrations of phosphorus in that water are really, really low, it doesn't take much once it gets to a lake to cause problems. Like 1 or 2 parts per million of phosphorus in lake water is all it takes to set off one of these algae blooms. So we as farmers really don't want to be doing that, or at least I hope we don't want to be doing that. Most of us don't want to be doing that. And one thing we actually haven't talked much about yet in this conversation is no-till farming. Interestingly, in one way, no-till farming is really good at preventing phosphorus pollution, and that is that no-till farming is really good at reducing soil erosion. And so one of the classic ways for phosphorus to get into water is when soil erodes, it's mostly the finer, more fertility-bearing parts of the soil that wash away. And so if you've got soil erosion going on, that can transport phosphorus from a field into water. On the other hand, in a no-till situation, because you're not tilling and mixing stuff into the soil, no-till soils over time tend to become stratified in terms of nutrients. So lots of nutrients right at the surface, and then the nutrient content decreases as you go deeper in the soil. And that's especially the case with phosphorus because phosphorus doesn't move very fast at all in the soil. So it tends to accumulate at the surface. Also in a no-till situation, you tend to get lots of good soil structure, which promotes the infiltration of rainwater or snowmelt or whatever into the soil, which is a good thing. You also tend to get a lot of intact earthworm channels. And like a night crawler channel can go 3 or 4 feet, more or less straight down into the soil. And so when you get a rainfall event, it's a conduit for water to move directly into the soil, which is also a good thing. But when you get either a heavy rain that's moving through the soil or across the surface of the soil, the worm channels in the good soil structure can promote transport of dissolved phosphorus, again at a low concentration, but not a zero concentration, down through the soil profile, or that rich concentration of phosphorus right at the soil surface can easily be transported by cross-surface flow of water. So no-till is a good thing, but I think because of the stratification and the accelerated water transport, it's even more important in a no-till situation to be thinking about avoiding excess nutrients.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Okay, so in general, when we're talking about water infiltration to those depths, we are talking about, I mean, a lot of times when you have really good soil and you're testing the water that comes out the other side, it's getting filtered pretty well. Why would that not be happening, you think, with phosphorus?
Once the phosphorus is dissolved in water, again at a low concentration, but it's still there. It has to be there, or the plants can't take it up. If the phosphorus is tied up in soil by contact with the surface of soil particles, okay, and it either reacts with positive charges on the soil surface, or a more important mechanism is it reacts chemically with either calcium, iron, or aluminum that are present in the soil minerals, and becomes a really stable phosphorus-containing molecule that is plant unavailable, and it takes quite a lot of energy to break that molecule back apart to make the phosphorus be available. So once it's in water, if the water is free to move, the phosphorus is free to move with that water.
Okay, that makes sense. So this is, I mean, I know that you've in the past definitely been kind of a critic of the deep compost mulch system. Is it phosphorus more than nitrogen that's your biggest concern here?
It's actually both. It's actually both because it takes more nitrogen getting into a lake to cause trouble than it does phosphorus. It takes a higher concentration of nitrogen to stimulate an algae bloom, but there's more nitrogen in compost than there is phosphorus, and the nitrogen is a lot more mobile. So both have the potential to be a problem, and there is a finite capacity that both the mineral portion and the biological portion of soils have a capacity for tying up phosphorus and nitrogen, mostly just in terms of the living biomass that's in the soil. So, soil bacteria and soil fungi and so forth, they all need nitrogen. They also all need phosphorus. So to some extent, if there's nitrogen and phosphorus available, they will use it as a food source. It becomes tied up in their biomass, and even after they die, until their corpses decompose, that nitrogen and phosphorus is still tied up. And then the mineral part of the soil, we've all heard of the cation exchange capacity of the soil. So that is negative charges on soil mineral particles, mostly clay particles, and also on the surface of soil organic matter particles, negative charges that positively charged ions like calcium and magnesium can hitch onto and be held in place somewhat tightly, not so tightly that they can't re-enter the soil water solution so they can be taken up by plants, but tightly enough that they're not easily leached and lost. But the main form of nitrogen that's in soil is nitrate, which has a negative charge. And although there are some positive charges on the surface of organic matter and mineral particles that can hang on to these negatively charged ions, there's a lot fewer of them than there are the negatively charged sites. So the cation exchange capacity of the soil, its capacity to hold on to positively charged ions like calcium, is much, much higher than its anion exchange capacity, which is the ability to hang on to negatively charged ions. And both phosphorus and nitrogen have the main ions that they're present as are negatively charged.
Okay, that's interesting. So in a theoretically, a very healthy soil, well, two things, I guess. Can you increase the anion exchange capacity to hold in more of those negatively charged ions? And two, do I guess kind of in addition to those exist more in healthier soils? Like, are they able to immobilize those nutrients better, I guess?
To some extent, and yeah, I guess we need to. This whole train of thought started with we were going to discuss the capacity of the soil to hold on to these nutrients, and I got a little bit distracted. But soils have a finite capacity for holding on to plant nutrients. And to answer your question, can we change that? As far as the mineral part of the soil, basically no. So theoretically, you could add, say, if you have a sandy or sandy loam soil, if you added more clay to the soil, that would increase the mineral part of the soil's ability to hang on to nutrients. But in real world terms, it would take so much clay that it's not really doable from a practical point of view. But where we can increase the soil's nutrient holding capacity is by increasing organic matter. And so that ties directly into soil health. I mean, soil organic matter level is probably the single most important measure of soil health. Certainly there are other things involved, but if you had to choose one thing that you were going to use as an indicator of good soil health, the level of organic matter would probably be that one thing. So because organic matter does have both a cation and an exchange capacity, if we increase organic matter, yes, we will increase that capacity. But this whole saturation concept also applies to organic matter. And I'm going to get back to that in a minute, but the point I wanted to make is that the capacity of soil to hang on to nutrients is finite because there's only so many of these positively or negatively charged sites in the soil's exchange capacity that exist. It's a very, very large number, but it's still finite. And it's possible to saturate that exchange capacity. And then once it's saturated, there are no more of those charged sites to hold on to nutrient ions. It's when you get to phosphorus, and the main mechanism for holding phosphorus is by tying it up with iron or aluminum in acidic soils or calcium in alkaline soils. Again, there's a large but still finite number of iron, aluminum, or calcium atoms that are available to do that. So once that chemical complex is saturated with phosphorus, your soil has actually lost its ability to tie up more phosphorus. And at that point, the phosphorus becomes much more mobile and hence more easily lost from the soil. And a lot of soil tests now give you what's called a phosphorus index. On some tests, it's called the phosphorus index. Sometimes some soil tests is called a phosphorus saturation ratio. But what it's doing is it's looking at the amount of iron, aluminum, and calcium that's available in your soil to react with phosphorus. It's looking at that in relation to the amount of phosphorus that's in the soil. And as long as you have not completely saturated the soil with phosphorus, your soil is capable of binding phosphorus and holding it against loss. And where that saturation, the break point in that saturation ratio is really specific to different regions, to different soil types and so forth. Like the kind of clay that your soil has is a big factor in that. And so a soil test from Nova Scotia, say, would not apply in Kentucky in terms of where. So if you sent your Kentucky soil to the lab in Nova Scotia, they would not be able to give you a valid phosphorus index just because it's of the regional differences. But I think most, if not all, of the U.S. states are now offering that. I know that the NRCS is water quality has become a big part of their mandate, and NRCS people could definitely provide help with if the place you've been doing your soil tests with doesn't give a phosphorus saturation ratio, they could tell you where to get it and help you interpret it and help you figure out what to do if your soil is oversaturated with phosphorus, and what do you do now? They could definitely help with that, and for free, for no charge.
I'm wondering if this analogy would be accurate. So like when you take too much of a vitamin, let's say you take vitamin C and you take a bunch of it, at some point your body is like, that's enough. And then it just starts getting rid of the excess. Would that be kind
that's
of this?
Right, yeah.
Would that be sort of the same thing that's happening in soil?
I think that's a really good analogy, Jesse. And in fact, we can even carry that analogy a little further, because it's probably possible to take so much vitamin C, say, that it actually becomes bad for you. And you can get nutrient levels in soil to the point where it's actually detrimental to the soil biology rather than helping. And just to give one concrete example, most people listening, probably all people listening to this podcast, are familiar with mycorrhizal fungi. And so they form this symbiosis with plant roots, with the roots of most plant species. And the plant provides energy in the form of sugars to the fungus, which in trade gives the plant better access to water, phosphorus, zinc, maybe boron. And there's some evidence that a plant root that has mycorrhizal symbionts may also be more disease resistant, so more resistant to soil-borne root diseases. So it's a good thing. The thing is, though, there is a cost to the plant. It's not free. The mycorrhizal symbiosis can sometimes take 10, 15, maybe even 20% of all the energy that the plant captures by photosynthesis. So what happens is, if you have a soil that's got lots and lots of phosphorus in it, the plants won't form the mycorrhizal symbiosis, because basically the plant is in charge of whether the symbiosis happens or not. It sends out chemical signals that allow the fungus to establish the relationship with the plant root. And if there's lots of phosphorus around, the plant decides, okay, I don't need those fungi. I'm not going to spend the energy relating to them. I'm just going to go out on my own. The downside is the fungi did more than just provide they provide phosphorus. They also provided better access to water and to some of the micronutrients like zinc. So there is a loss to the plant, even though it doesn't need the fungus for phosphorus. It's losing some of the other benefits that the fungus gave to the plant when the plant decides not to enter into the symbiosis. So that would be one concrete example of having too much phosphorus in the soil is bad from a soil biology and soil health perspective. And then there's, of course, the whole issue of phosphorus loss into the environment and contributing to water pollution and so forth.
Hey, you all, last interruption. If you are interested in fertility management, consider coming to our no-till intensive in San Diego this upcoming February. In just a few weeks with Jared Smith of Jared's Real Food and Stephen Cornett of Nature's Always Right. Stephen in particular has been working on closing his loop and gaining his fertility for his micro farm from his own farm. So through KNF and other techniques. So it'll be super cool to hear about that and Jared's growing systems with the lasagna gardens. And I'm also going to present as well. And Josh Satton's going to be there doing some filming and hanging out. So more info at notillgrowers.com/events. All right, back to David. Right. And so I think one thing that's important to point out here, though, is we've been talking about phosphorus and compost. Phosphorus in compost is generally or almost exclusively going to be, to that point when it's excessive in manure-based composts. We haven't talked about mushroom-based composts or mixes of different mulches and those sorts of things.
That's certainly true. So I guess my message to people using deep compost would be, get it tested by a reliable lab so you know what you're putting onto your field. And then there's lots of data available on what the nutrient requirements of different crops are. So know what you're putting down, know what the needs of your crop are, and try to strike some reasonable balance between what the crop can actually use and what you're putting down. Because if you keep putting down more nutrients than the crop can possibly use, then eventually, your soil is going to become oversaturated with nutrients, and they are going to start leaking out into the environment where they can be a problem, including potentially into your own well. Most farms use well water for irrigation and drinking, and so there's the possibility for the problem to arise right there at home, and an even greater possibility for it to arise, out in your wider landscape. There was a case on the forum last winter or last spring where somebody sent in a compost analysis and said, I'm thinking about putting 4 inches of this on my beds. What do you think? And because we had this really nice detailed analysis from A&L Labs, it was possible to work through the nutrient management accounting and see what was a 4-inch application actually going to add to the soil in terms of nutrients. And in terms of nitrogen, it was like 5 times what any conceivable vegetable crop could use in a year. And that was the nitrogen that was going to be mineralized and available that year. The total nitrogen application was like 6,000 pounds. And, going with a conservative estimate of 10 to 15% of that becoming plant available in year 1, that translated to like 600 to 900 pounds of available N for 1 year. And you'd be hard-pressed to think of a vegetable crop that needs more than 200 pounds per acre of nitrogen per year. I mean, you can grow 200 bushel an acre corn on 200 pounds of nitrogen a year. Most vegetable crops that we're growing it's more like 100 to maybe 150 pounds of N, just to sort of put it in ballpark context. So if you've got 600 to 900 pounds of available N, and you're only able to use 150, maybe 200 of that, that extra N is just not going to stick around. A lot of it is going to move out into the environment, and then it's a problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
So now that was a fairly high testing compost. If my memory serves me right, it was 1.5% N. It was municipal compost is what it was. So in compost, of course, vary hugely in their nutrient content. So for somebody who wants to use the deep compost system, my suggestion to them would be to try to source some fairly low analysis compost.
Yeah, I agree. And
I want to tell you about a little experiment that we've been trying this year. I mean, I totally get the appeal of the deep compost thing because it's relatively easy and it works. In our greenhouses, especially, we farm them year round, and the nutrient status is high. Like all of the nutrients, when we send in a soil test, they're coming back high, in some cases excessive. So we really want to be careful about what we're adding. So we don't want to be adding a deep layer of compost to seed into. But we would also really not like to be tilling to establish seed beds, for seeded crops like spinach, say. So what we started trying for this winter's growing season is we used a layer of potting soil as the deep mulch. It's more expensive than compost. So where we live, because of transportation costs, compost that's acceptable for certified organic use is quite expensive. It's about $60 a yard delivered. By partnering with the local farmers co-op and sort of planning in advance and buying a lot of potting mix at once, we can get potting mix for about $70 a yard, and that's a certified organic potting mix. So it's more expensive, but it's not like crazy more expensive, and it has some nutrients in it, but not even enough nutrients like for a spinach crop. So in other words, we're not overloading the soil with nutrients by putting down 1.5 inches or 2 inches of potting mix and feeding into that. And the potting mix is also sort of optimized for seed germination because that was its intended use. So what we did on these beds, we've now got, I think, 4 5 of them going. I'll describe the most recent one we did. It grew a crop of hot peppers over the summer, which were mulched with hay. And because of the thick hay mulch on the pepper plants, it was a clean bed. There were a few weeds, of course, but not a lot. So we pulled the pepper plants out by the roots, knocked the soil off the roots. They went onto the compost pile. We forked the hay mulch onto an adjacent bed, which was growing kale, had some big, tall kale plants, so that could easily accept an addition to its existing hay mulch. Pulled the few weeds that were left by hand, did no tillage on the bed. We spread some alfalfa pellets as a nutrient source, because we'll probably pick this spinach bed 4 or 5 times over the course of the winter. And so it needs a reasonable shot of nutrients. And then we put about 1.5 inches of compost over the top of the bed. And we tried the Brian O'Hara approach, the broadcast seeding. Broadcast some seed onto the surface of that, sprinkled a little more potting mix over the top, and lightly rolled it to, just to firm it down a little bit. And we have gotten amazingly good germination. In fact, the first bed we did, we were kind of shooting in the dark about how much seed to put down because Brian didn't talk about that in the podcast. Presumably that's going to be in his book when it comes out. Anyway, we got the seeding rate a little too high on the first beds we did, so we had to thin them, and it was a denser stand than optimum. But we've been fine-tuning that, and it looks really encouraging, both in terms of the amount of spinach that we're getting out of those beds, the fact that there was 0 tillage done, and we didn't overload the soil with nutrients. So I would just toss that out as a possibility for somebody to consider if your soil is already at a high nutrient status and you want to do some kind of mulch that you can directly seed into, but without pouring more unneeded nutrients onto your fields.
Yeah, I think it would be cool too, David, if I guess you probably haven't been able to yet, but it would be interesting to see like a financial analysis of that too, in terms of that, how much it cost you to do that, that potting mix.
Yeah. So we don't. So we're only just we've started harvesting some of the spinach on the earlier planted beds, but the harvest isn't complete yet. So we don't have. We know what the cost was, but we don't yet know what the total income is. But on the bed I just described, it's in the 96-foot greenhouse, so it's about a 90-foot bed. I put $100 worth of potting mix down, so like a yard and a half of potting mix down, and so I spent $100 on the mix, and then there was probably, I don't know, $20 worth of alfalfa pellets that went down, and so we're selling a bag of spinach that weighed it, and it's baby leaf, but not like crazy baby leaf. The leaves are maybe 2 to 3 inches long and, 1.5 inches to 2 inches wide. We're selling a third of a pound of that in a bag for $4. So in 25 bags, I've recovered the cost of putting that potting mix down. The first picking off that bed will probably yield 40 to 50 bags. And then we'll probably pick it 3 to 4 more times with a slowly declining yield per pick. But, just like I said, the experiment isn't complete yet, but just based on the upfront cost and expected yield from past experience, the economics look pretty good to me.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's we have trouble getting decent potting mix here. Usually we've been using Vermont compost. I've heard of a couple more people kind of springing up in relatively closer areas. But one called Sprout up in Columbus, Ohio, and I forget there's another one that's a little bit maybe to the west. But yeah, one thing with that I think about is like the peat moss issue, because that's generally a huge component, and that's more local to you than it is down here. So finding some sort of maybe more local or environmentally sound option to mix with the compost or some other, we have a lot of leaves and a lot of wood mulch, so maybe there's some option there to mitigate that nutrient issue.
Yeah, you could maybe mix. So like if the only compost you could source was quite high in nutrients, maybe you could dilute it down on farm with some, more carbonaceous materials and fine tune it a little bit to more what you needed in terms of nutrients. I think there's tremendous potential there. It's just, it seemed to me in reading about and listening to people describing the deep mulch system that the whole issue of the potential for excess nutrients was just being completely ignored. And I just wanted to bring that to people's attention that, this is something that we really ought to be thinking about, both for the long-term health of our own soils and for the health of the landscapes that surround us.
Yeah, and I think that we should be doing that. I say this a lot, or at least I hope I say it a lot. I should say it more maybe, is that we need to always be challenging ourselves to be better, because a lot of what our systems feed off of now, currently, are not necessarily sustainable overall. We can't just.
Right. Exactly.
So yeah, I think we should be challenging ourselves to make sure that what we're doing and what we're moving towards is accomplishing what we want it to, and not just a different form of what we're trying to get away from. So no, I think that's great. It should be challenged. We should always be challenging ourselves. So, but one thing I wanted to ask you about that we kind of touched on earlier, if you have a few more minutes,
sure,
is the oversaturation of organic matter. I think this is something that people probably don't realize can happen. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So in the last 20 years, and even more so the last 10 years, there's been this literally a revolution in our understanding of soil organic matter. So when I was in ag school back in the mid-'70s, the idea of organic matter was that it started out as plant residues or as manures or whatever, and it gradually decomposed. And then there came a point where what was left couldn't really be decomposed any further. So it was the organic matter itself was what they call recalcitrant, chemically recalcitrant. There were no microbes that could decompose it any further. And so based in how much of this recalcitrant stuff was left over at the end of the day had a lot to do with what the starting material was. So say a clover green manure that you tilled in or left on the surface or whatever, but it was fresh and green and had a low carbon to nitrogen ratio, that a material like that would basically vanish and would not contribute to long-term stable soil organic matter. Whereas something like straw or corn stalks or wood chips, which have a lot more lignin in them, and which definitely decompose more slowly at first than, say, a clover green manure crop would, that would contribute a lot more to long-lasting organic matter. What we now know is that soil microbes can decompose almost anything. And while it's true that something like wood chips at first is going to decompose more slowly than clover, for example, at the end of the day, the wood chips or the corn stalks will decompose just as thoroughly and just as completely as the clover would. So now we understand that organic matter is not this recalcitrant leftovers that the microbes just can't eat. It's like the bones from the steak. They eat the meat and they leave the bones. That's not the way it is. What organic matter is, for the most part, is living and dead microbes and their various byproducts that are left from them. So stable organic matter is plant residues or animal residues like manure that have been processed through the whole soil food web and stabilized by mechanisms like being protected on the inside of soil aggregates where the oxygen level is low, so the decomposers are limited by lack of oxygen, or by ultra small pore spaces inside of soil aggregates that are like sub-micron size. So a micron is a millionth of a meter, a thousandth of a millimeter. It's very, very small. But a typical soil bacteria is maybe 1 to 2 microns in diameter. So if inside a soil aggregate, and a soil aggregate is not solid, it's this maze of tiny passages and particles and so forth. If there are passages that are smaller than a micron, and there's a little film of bacterial residue or something inside that, the bacteria that are living and are looking for something to eat literally cannot access that organic matter because it's inside a hole that's smaller than they are. So that's one mechanism for stabilizing organic matter inside aggregates. Another is that organic matter can react with the soil's exchange capacity in a similar way to the way cations and so forth do. And once the organic matter particles become attached to soil surfaces, they're resistant to being degraded further by the soil microbes that are alive and looking for something to eat. The thing about these stabilization mechanisms is they're all reversible. And so when we talk about soil carbon sequestration and so forth, we have to be really careful that we don't undo by some mistaken practice in the future everything that we gained by building up soil organic matter. But it also means that that a given soil has a finite capacity to have stabilized organic matter, because the stabilization of the organic matter is tied up with the mineral and biological properties of the soil. It's not due to the fact that the organic matter reached a point where it could not be decomposed any further. So we have to think about organic matter is like this flow of carbon atoms that are entering the soil, through plants and through compost and through manure that we add to the soil, and then a lot of it flows back out to the atmosphere as microbes eat the organic matter and decompose it. they exhale carbon dioxide just like we humans do with, we take in food and we exhale carbon dioxide in water. So do soil microbes. But what we need to do is get a balance where we're inputting more carbon atoms into the soil than what are being exhaled back out. If we can achieve that, then we can build soil organic matter. On the other hand, if we're losing more than is coming in, then soil organic matter levels are going down. And that's been the story of agriculture for the last 200 years. I mean, the fact that prairie soils, say, which before European settlers arrived were, maybe 5 or 6% organic matter, maybe even higher, and we're sort of in this stable state, where you had bison grazing and dropping manure on the surface and plants growing and legumes fixing nitrogen. So carbon was coming in, carbon was going out, but there was this large stable pool that stayed in place in the soil. And then people came along and started plowing the soil, and which tipped the balance in favor of loss. So we were losing more than we gained. And that right there is a really good argument against the idea that there is some sort of stable organic matter that's resistant to further decomposition. If that were the case, then why did we lose half or more of the organic matter that the native soils had? So the practical implication of all that is that in terms of our soil management, we need to be thinking about this flow of carbon atoms into and out of the soil, and what can we do to maximize the input of carbon into the soil and minimize what we're losing back into the atmosphere. And cover crops would be a really good example. So say you were growing vegetable crops for 5 months out of the year, and you had living roots in the soil and had residues being added to the soil for 5 months, and then for the remaining 7 months, nothing happened. Then say you started planting rye or some other cover crop in the fall when your veggies were done, which are keeping living roots in the soil all year round. And although they may go kind of dormant during the coldest part of the winter, during those shoulder seasons in mid to late fall and early to mid spring, when there's no crop growing, you've still got a living plant that is adding carbon to the soil, both by exuding it through its roots, and then when you're done with it, there's a carbon-rich crop residue that can be added back to the soil. So that would just be one example of how thinking about carbon in terms of this cycling flow through the soil, we need to think about how can we optimize that to maintain and hopefully even build organic matter levels. But the point, I guess the original point was there is a limit to how much organic matter a given soil can have in a stable form. There's no limit to how much you could add. Like you could add 100 tons of compost to your soil and do a before and after soil test. And the after soil test would show that, yes, the organic matter level went up. But if the soil can't stabilize all of that compost that you added, it's going to start leaking nutrients out into the environment. So in other words, soil does not have an infinite capacity to hang on to and utilize nutrients.
I think that the carbon cycle is a really fascinating thing, and it's also kind of daunting. What you were saying about cover crops, like it requires this constant photosynthesis, this constant interaction with the soil.
It is fascinating stuff. And one thing I'm going to do, Jesse, is send you a sort of a reading list of freely accessible materials that talk about all this stuff. And maybe you can post that up on the website, and people can, if this is interesting to people, it's just going to provide them a place to turn to learn more about it.
Yeah, I think that's great. That would be great. We'd definitely post that.
I guess do you have a few more minutes to talk a little bit?
Sure, let's go for it.
Because one other aspect of no-till that we do on our farm that we touched on but didn't really get into is the whole mulch-based, not compost mulch, or not mulch that you can direct seed into, but mulch of hay or straw or leaves or whatever that you can put transplants into. Because that's a big approach that we use, both with grown-in-place mulches or hay mulch that we add. And just briefly, the way we're doing that is we put the mulch down, typically when it's shaken out, like a 5 to 6 inch deep layer. We lay drip lines down, one drip line per row. So if it's going to be a 3-row bed of, say, kale, there's 3 drip lines. Onions or leeks, there are 4 rows of beds, so there'd be 4 lines. And we have drip line with either 4, 8, or 12 inch spacing of the emitters. So we can come up with a whole bunch of different combinations of spacings. So we put the mulch down, lay out the drip lines, put water through the drip lines so that they'll, we can get them nice and straight. They stay put, and then we just come along with a dibble, make a hole right through the mulch, and put transplants in at each emitter. So the drip lines are serving both as a sort of a row marker to get a reasonably straight row, and then we're using the emitters to space the plants at whatever space it is that we need. And that's worked out really well for us. And we do a fair amount of fertigation. So one aspect of not putting huge amounts of compost down all at once is for a long-term crop, like, say, greenhouse tomatoes, or say an outdoor kale bed that you're going to harvest repeatedly, possibly over several months. If you put all the fertility down at once that you thought it was going to need for the whole season, it might be too much to put all at once. Also, there would be the risk of loss of those nutrients, so they wouldn't be there at the end of the season when the plants needed them. So we do we have a proportioner that we can add soluble, organically approved nutrients, mostly nitrogen, sometimes potassium on our tomatoes, sometimes calcium on our tomatoes. Can add that through the drip lines and just sort of top up the nutrient supplies a little bit as the plants need it, which means we don't have to put this enormous charge of nutrients down at once. And one of the articles I'm going to give you a link to is about an experiment that they did in Israel in organic greenhouses of putting all the compost down at once versus some compost and then some supplemental feeding. And they measured nitrates in the groundwater under the greenhouses. And it's kind of amazing how much of a difference that made in terms of the efficiency with which the nitrogen was used. So I'll give you a link to that so people can read up on that a little bit if they want. And I guess the final thing I wanted to mention to you is we did this year invest in a no-till grain drill for planting our cover crops. And so the way we were doing cover crops was very much like Sean Yadnicek described on his farm a few weeks ago, where they were actually doing some tillage to get some exposed soil, broadcasting seed, and then covering the seed up. I forget how Sean did it. We were doing it by a super shallow pass with our spading machine. Anyway, it was time consuming and it did involve some actual tillage. So what we can do now is once a crop is done and we're ready to plant a cover crop, we can flail mow the cover crop, the cash crop residue, just leave it right in place, and we've got this true no-till grain drill. It's only 4 feet wide, goes on our 3-point hitch, and we can just see the cover crop right through whatever residue or mulch is left in place there. And whereas it used to take, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes to prepare, hand seed, and cover one of our beds with a cover crop, it literally takes about 30 seconds with the no-till drill. It's kind of amazing. And there's no tillage at all involved. We don't have to make that initial shallow tillage pass and then the covering tillage pass.
Yeah, that's great. I feel like that's something that really needs to kind of get some reinforcement on the small scale, especially like bed systems, is having some sort of seed drill that is effective in that situation, because I haven't seen a lot of that.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's cool to hear that you're using that, because that's something that's been on my mind a lot too. It's just, it would be great to have that option of just drilling straight into crop residue.
Right. And so because this is a grain drill, it doesn't have the precision that a vegetable seeder would need, but I want to start digging around to see. There are definitely no-till vegetable seeders out there, but is anybody doing it on a scale that works for narrow bed systems? And I haven't had time to really look into that yet, but it would be kind of neat if somebody did. For agronomic crops, the planter technology that's out there is just amazing. I mean, people are now direct planting into 6 foot, they're planting corn or soybeans into 6 foot tall standing rye, and then coming through a week or two later and roller crimping the rye, and then it's done. That's it.
That's interesting. I actually haven't seen that. I was just talking, somebody that will be on the podcast before this one airs is Susanna Lane, and she broadcasts beans and various things into standing rye and then crimps it and gets good germination that way. But I hadn't heard of anybody doing that on kind of a conventional scale with mechanization. That's really interesting.
Yeah. And I had never heard of Susanna Lane, but there was that post on the forum that just appeared, and I think it was just last evening I read that little article about her from Cornell, and I thought, wow, that's amazing to be, growing field crops basically just by broadcasting seed, and then, it's without planter technology. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I look forward to hearing what you say about that episode, because it'll be up 1 or 2 episodes before yours, and she's great. She's a good friend of mine, and I think what she's doing is incredible and really brilliant, low tech method for getting crops into to standing rye.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to listening to that.
Well, David Blanchard, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, you're very welcome. I really enjoyed talking with you, Jesse.
All right, if you enjoyed that episode, I will put up some of David and Cindy's farm links in the show notes. We will also get together a post with the links David mentioned. Also, go check out the forum at no-tillgrowers.com in the community tab. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you're getting it. Come see us in San Diego on February 15th. Come see me on March 7th in Louisville at the Organic Association of Kentucky Conference, a.k.a. the Oak Conference, one of the best in the country. Join the Patreon page if you at all can. I know it seems like we're hauling in money over there, but we're not. We're reinvesting a huge amount of that money every month into new content. Like when we go to San Diego, we're going to come home with a ton of content from that. It also goes to equipment and other things. Remember, I started this podcast and no-till growers and all these things not to quit farming, be a full-time creator or podcaster or whatever, but to become a better farmer. So that information is as valuable to me as anyone, and that's why I do it. That's how I do it, and I make sure that that money does something for everyone. So big thank you to you for your support. Big thank you to Jackson Roulette and Josh Satin. Biggest thank you imaginable to my amazing wife, Hannah, without whom I could not do any of this. Other than that, thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye. Yeah, well, David, I really appreciate that. I think that was excellent. I think that you should go on a speaking tour. You're really good at articulating some of this stuff, specifically in a way that is digestible, because I think that it's easy to get in the weeds on this stuff.
It's true. It is. Yeah.
And so, no, I think that was great. I think that was that's going to be a lot of fun to publish this one. And I know people are going to ask, do you have any relation to Chris Blanchard?
I don't, at least no known relation.
Okay. I had to check.